What if I told you that the next global economic collapse isn't a possibility, it's a blueprint? What if the financial pain you feel right now, the inflation eating your paycheck, the debt that never seems to shrink, the sense that the game is rigged, what if all of it was engineered exactly as designed? Here is the truth: they ain't want trending. The global financial elite aren't trying to prevent the next crisis. They're preparing to profit from it. And the mechanism they built to do it is hiding in plain sight. Buried in the shadow banking system, a $55 trillion dark pool of unregulated derivatives, collateralized debt, and synthetic leverage that makes the 2008 mortgage crisis look like a dress rehearsal. You think the great financial crisis taught them a lesson? It didn't. It taught them a formula: create complexity, privatize profits, socialize losses, repeat. And right now, in 2025, that formula is running on steroids, supercharged by central bank coordination, algorithmic trading, and a derivatives market so large and interconnected that a single failure could cascade through the entire global system in hours. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This community is growing because we're done accepting the sanitized version of financial history. If you want the unfiltered truth, the kind that connects the dots they hope you'll ignore, hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to show you will change how you see every central bank decision, every bailout, and every promise that this time is different. Let's start with the story they've buried, and then I'll show you the receipt. 1929. The stock market crashes. 13 million Americans lose their jobs. Banks collapse by the thousands. The Great Depression reshapes an entire generation's relationship with money, trust, and institutions. But here is what they ain't teach you in school. The crash wasn't a natural disaster. It was the inevitable consequence of a decade-long debt binge fueled by unregulated speculation, margin lending, and a financial elite convinced they discovered a new paradigm where risk didn't matter anymore. Sound familiar? In the 1920s, ordinary Americans were encouraged to buy stocks on margin, meaning you could control $100 of stock with just $10 down. Banks weren't lending against real assets anymore. They were lending against the fantasy of perpetual growth. Investment trusts, the precursors to modern hedge funds, were stacking leverage on leverage, creating pyramids of debt 3, 4, 5 layers deep. When reality hit, the entire structure disintegrated in days. Now, fast forward to today. The shadow banking system, the network of hedge funds, private equity firms, money market funds, and special purpose vehicles, operates with virtually no regulatory oversight. These institutions hold $55 trillion in assets, more than double the size of the traditional banking sector. And just like the 1920s, they're playing with borrowed money, except now, instead of 10-to-1 leverage, we're seeing ratios of 30-to-1, 50-to-1, in some derivative strategies, even 100-to-1. Sound familiar? Here's where it gets darker. After the Great Depression, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, separating commercial banking from investment banking to prevent another crisis. It worked for 66 years. Then, in 1999, under pressure from Wall Street lobbyists and promises of a new era of financial innovation, President Clinton signed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, repealing Glass-Steagall. Within 9 years, the global financial system collapsed. The official story says deregulation was necessary to compete globally, to modernize, to innovate. The real story? It was a coup. The financial elite wanted to merge the safety of government-backed deposits with the gambling profits of speculative trading. They wanted to be too big to fail, and they got exactly what they wanted. By 2007, 5 banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs, controlled more than 40% of all banking assets in the United States. They weren't just banks. They were hedge funds with a taxpayer guarantee. When their bets on subprime mortgages imploded, they didn't go bankrupt. You bailed them out. $700 billion in TARP funds. $16 trillion in secret Federal Reserve loans. The largest wealth transfer from the public to the private sector in human history. Sound familiar? Because here's what's happening right now in 2025. Those same banks, alongside BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, now control over $20 trillion in assets. They're not just too big to fail, they're too big to exist. And they've spent the last 15 years doubling down on the exact same playbook: derivatives. The global derivatives market is now valued at conservatively $600 trillion. That's more than 7 times global GDP. These aren't productive investments. They're bets. Bets on interest rates, currency fluctuations, commodity prices, corporate defaults, sovereign debt crises. It's a casino, except the chips are backed by your pension fund, your mortgage, your country's treasury bonds. And here's the kicker: nobody knows who's holding the bag. Derivatives are traded over the counter, meaning privately, between institutions, with no public record, no clearinghouse, no transparency. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, it took 3 years just to untangle their derivative positions. 3 years. Lehman held $639 billion in assets. Today, JP Morgan alone holds $54 trillion in derivative exposure. Let me repeat that. $54 trillion. That's more than twice the entire GDP of the United States, concentrated in one institution, linked through counterparty risk to every major bank, hedge fund, and pension system on Earth. You think that's an accident? You think that's market efficiency? That's a controlled demolition blueprint. Because when the crisis hits, and it will, the elites won't lose. They'll be first in line for the bailout, the liquidity injection, the emergency monetary policy, and you'll be told to tighten your belt, accept austerity, and trust the system that betrayed you. The Great Depression taught them nothing about ethics. It taught them everything about control. So how did we get here? How did the global financial system become a ticking time bomb designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many? The answer lies in a single decision made in the aftermath of 2008, a decision so buried, so technical, so deliberately obscured that most people have never heard of it. But it's the key to everything. It's called the Central Bank Liquidity Swap Network. Here's what they don't tell you. During the 2008 crisis, the global banking system nearly collapsed, not because of a lack of assets, but because of a lack of dollars. Foreign banks had gorged themselves on dollar-denominated debt, subprime mortgages packaged and sold as safe investments. When the housing market crashed, those banks needed dollars to cover their losses, but they couldn't get them. Credit markets froze. Panic spread. The entire system was hours away from a full-scale meltdown. So the Federal Reserve, in coordination with the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the Swiss National Bank, created an emergency mechanism: unlimited dollar swap lines. Essentially, foreign central banks could exchange their local currency for dollars directly from the Fed. No questions asked, no limits, no public disclosure. Between 2007 and 2010, the Federal Reserve secretly lent over $16 trillion to foreign banks, corporations, and governments. $16 trillion. That's more than the entire federal budget. And the American public didn't know until a government audit forced disclosure in 2011. But here's the twist: those swap lines never went away. They're still active, permanent, ready to deploy the moment the next crisis hits. And in March 2020, when COVID lockdowns triggered a global market panic, the Fed activated them again, pumping hundreds of billions into the system within days. This isn't monetary policy. It's a secret global bailout. Infrastructure, a permanent backstop for the financial elite, disguised as crisis management. And the name behind the architecture of this system: the person who championed its expansion and normalization. You won't believe the name. But before I tell you, you need to understand the mechanics. Because once you see how this works, you'll never look at central banks the same way again. The receipt is wilder than you think. Let's break this down, step by step, because this is where the illusion becomes undeniable. The shadow banking system and the derivatives market function on one core principle: Collateral rehypothecation. That's a fancy term for a simple scam. It means taking the same asset and using it as collateral for multiple loans simultaneously. Imagine you own a car worth $20,000. You use it as collateral to borrow $15,000 from Bank A. But then Bank A takes your car title and uses it to borrow $12,000 from Bank B. Bank B does the same with Bank C. Now, your single $20,000 car is supporting $45,000 in loans. Everyone's balance sheet looks great. But if you default, the entire chain collapses because that car only exists once. Now scale that to the global financial system. In the derivatives market, a single treasury bond, a single block of mortgage-backed securities, a single corporate loan can be rehypothecated 8, 10, 12 times. The same collateral is being counted as an asset by multiple institutions, creating a phantom multiplication of wealth that exists only on paper. The Bank for International Settlements estimated that in 2019, before COVID, total collateral rehypothecation in the global shadow banking system exceeded $10 trillion. $10 trillion of imaginary wealth, built on real assets that had already been pledged multiple times over. And here's the moral hazard. Everyone knows it's a con, but as long as the music keeps playing, as long as markets keep going up, nobody asks questions. Because the moment someone demands their collateral back, the moment confidence cracks, the entire pyramid implodes. 2008 proved this. Lehman Brothers was using the same mortgage-backed securities as collateral for dozens of different loans. When housing prices fell and counterparties started demanding repayment, Lehman couldn't deliver. They didn't own the assets anymore. They'd been sold, resold, repackaged, and pledged so many times that nobody knew where the real collateral was. The bank collapsed in 48 hours. And what did the government do? They bailed out everyone else who'd played the same game. AIG, the insurance giant, had sold credit default swaps, essentially insurance policies on those toxic mortgage securities, to every major bank on Wall Street. When the mortgages defaulted, AIG owed $180 billion, money they didn't have. So the government gave it to them, $180 billion of taxpayer money, funneled directly through AIG to Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, and others. 100 cents on the dollar, no haircut, no consequences. The precedent was set: privatized profits, socialized losses. The rich gamble, the public pays. Now, it's talk about the swap lines, because this is where the conspiracy goes global. When the Fed activates currency swap lines, it's not lending to foreign governments directly. It's lending to foreign central banks, who then lend to their domestic banks and corporations, at rates and terms decided in private. There's no congressional oversight, no public debate, no accountability. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve expanded swap lines to 14 central banks, pumping over $446 billion into global markets in a matter of weeks. The Bank of Japan alone drew $200 billion. The European Central Bank drew another $130 billion. But here is what they do ain't tell you. Those dollars didn't go to small businesses or struggling workers. They went to the largest multinational corporations and banks, the ones who'd spent the previous decade buying back their own stock, paying executive bonuses, and maximizing leverage. Companies like Boeing, which had spent $43 billion on stock buybacks instead of maintaining cash reserves, were suddenly desperate for liquidity. And the Fed, through the swap lines and domestic facilities, made sure they got it. This is the global reset agenda in action. Not a conspiracy theory, a documented policy framework designed to ensure that the financial elite never face the consequences of their greed. And it's accelerating. In 2021, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Swiss National Bank, and the Bank of Canada formalized a standing repo facility, a permanent mechanism allowing unlimited dollar liquidity swaps at any time, for any reason, with no expiration date. Translation: the global bailout infrastructure is now permanent, automated, ready to deploy at the first sign of instability. But it gets worse. Because the derivatives market isn't just about collateral games. It's about control. Interest rate swaps, the largest segment of the derivatives market, allow banks to bet on the direction of interest rates without owning the underlying bonds. In 2024, the notional value of outstanding interest rate derivatives exceeded $460 trillion. $460 trillion. Think about that. Central banks around the world are raising and lowering interest rates, claiming they're fighting inflation or supporting growth. But every single decision they make enriches or bankrupts specific players in the derivatives market. And who sits on the advisory boards of those central banks? Former Goldman Sachs executives, former BlackRock executives, former JP Morgan executives. The revolving door isn't a metaphor, it's the business model. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, has been called the fourth branch of government because his firm manages $10 trillion in assets and advises the Federal Reserve on asset purchases. When the Fed decided to buy corporate bonds during COVID, who did they hire to manage the program? BlackRock. Who profited from those purchases? BlackRock's clients, which include the world's largest banks and hedge funds. This isn't capitalism, it's parasitic finance, a system where the productive economy, the workers, the small businesses, the real innovation, is bled dry to feed a speculative superstructure that produces nothing but risk and inequality. And the final piece of the puzzle: synthetic CDOs. Collateralized debt obligations, the same toxic instruments that caused 2008, are back. Except now they're called CLOs, collateralized loan obligations. And they're bigger than ever. $1.4 trillion in outstanding CLOs, backed by corporate junk debt, bundled, sliced, and sold to pension funds and insurance companies as safe investments. Sound familiar? The rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, Fitch, the same ones who gave AAA ratings to subprime garbage in 2007, are doing it again. 70% of CLOs carry investment-grade ratings, even though they're backed by loans to over-leveraged, zombie companies that can barely cover their interest payments. When the next recession hits, when defaults spike, those CLOs will collapse. And the banks, the hedge funds, the elites who engineered them, will walk away clean, protected by swap lines, bailout facilities, and central bank liquidity. You'll lose your job. They'll get a bonus. This is the system. This is the global reset agenda. Not a plan to fix capitalism, but a plan to consolidate control, eliminate competition, and ensure that the financial aristocracy never faces a reckoning. So where does that leave us? The next collapse won't look like 2008. It'll be faster, more global, more devastating, because the system is more interconnected, more leveraged, and more fragile than ever before. Algorithmic trading means that a crisis in one market can cascade across the entire planet in seconds. High-frequency trading firms execute 70% of all stock trades, and they're programmed to sell at the first sign of volatility. When panic hits, there's no circuit breaker fast enough to stop it. The derivatives market is a web of counterparty risk so complex that even the banks don't fully understand their exposure. When one institution fails, it triggers margin calls, collateral seizures, and forced liquidations that ripple through every connected firm. Lehman proved that. But Lehman was $639 billion. The next Lehman could be $50 trillion. And the central banks? They'll print. They'll swap. They'll backstop. Just like they always do. But there's a limit. A point where currency debasement, inflation, and debt saturation break the social contract. Where the public stops believing the lie. We're closer to that point than most people realize. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Inflation is eroding purchasing power. Wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. And the elites are preparing, buying bunkers, hoarding assets, lobbying for digital currencies that give them even more control over your money. The lesson of history is clear. Systems built on borrowed time and engineered illusions always collapse. The only question is whether we learn from the collapse or repeat it. 1929 taught us that unregulated speculation destroys economies. We forgot. 2008 taught us that too big to fail is too big to exist. We ignored it. What will 2025 teach us? Denial is expensive, and the bill is coming due. But here's the thing. You have agency. You can choose not to participate in the illusion. You can choose to educate yourself, protect your assets, build resilience, and demand accountability from the institutions that claim to serve you. This channel exists because the mainstream narrative is a controlled script written by the same people who profit from your ignorance. If you found value in this breakdown, share it. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. Tell me if you think the system can be reformed, or if it's beyond repair. And if you're serious about understanding the forces shaping your financial future, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started. The next videos will dive deeper into central bank, digital currencies, the coming commercial real estate collapse, and the hidden mechanisms they're using to engineer the Great Reset. The question isn't whether the next crisis is coming, it's whether you'll see it coming and be ready. Are we wiser now? Or are we walking the same path in better suits? The answer is up to you.